certainly don't want the Leader of the Opposition shouted down. You might not like the day, but this is the day that we've got. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not bothered. I assumed it was directed over here. Can I start by warmly welcoming the honourable member for Bury South to his new place in the House and to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Mr. Speaker, like so many people up and down the country, he has concluded that the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves, whereas the Labour Party stands ready to provide an alternative government that the country can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party has changed, and so has the Conservative Party. He and anyone else who wants to build a new Britain built on decency, security, prosperity and respect is welcome in my Labour Party. Every week, the Prime Minister offers absurd and frankly unbelievable defences to the Downing Street parties, and each week it unravels.
I've been elected the chair. I don't need to be told how to conduct the business. So if somebody wants to do some direction, I'll start directing them out of the chamber. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I see the very noise. I'm sure the Chief Whip has told them to bring their own booze.
Order. Let's try and get on with questions. It's going to be a long day if not. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, first he said there were no parties. Then the video landed, blowing that defence out the water. Next he said he was sickened and furious when he found out about the parties, until it turned out that he himself was at the Downing Street garden party. Then last week he said he didn't realise he was at a party, and surprise, surprise, no one believed him. So this week, he's got a new defence. Nobody warned me that it was against the rules. That's it. Nobody told him. Since the Prime Minister wrote the rules, why on earth does he think that his new defence is going to work for him?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, he talks about the rules, and let me repeat what I said to the honourable lady across the aisle earlier on. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we must wait for the outcome of the inquiry. But I renew what I've said, Mr. Speaker. But when it comes to his view,
nobody believes what you say. Can we have a little less? I want to this Prime Minister like I wanted to Leader of the Opposition. I want the same courtesy from both sides. Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, if we'd listened to the right honourable gentleman about COVID restrictions, which is the substance of his question, then, Mr. Speaker, we would still be we would have been in lockdown after July. If this is the truth, if we listened to the Labour front bench in the run-up to Christmas and New Year, Mr. Speaker, we would have stayed in restrictions with huge damage to the economy. And it's because of the judgments that I've taken and that we have taken in Downing Street that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and GDP, Mr. Speaker, now back up above pre-pandemic levels. And as for Bury South, Mr. Speaker, as for Bury South, let me say to the right gentleman, Mr. Speaker, by all leave, may I say to the right honourable gentleman that the Conservative Party won Bury South for the first time in generations under this Prime Minister, with an agenda of uniting and levelling up and delivering for the people of Bury South. And, Mr. Speaker, we will win again in Bury South at the next election under this Prime Minister.
Look, it's important I want to hear both sides, and I don't want this continuous chant, because if we do, there'll be less people on these benches, and the same on the other side. I expect both sides to be heard with courtesy. Keir Starmer.
Bury South is now a Labour seat, Prime Minister.
Sorry. Did somebody want me to apologise? No, somebody shouted apologise. I hope it wasn't aimed at me. No. And so we'll also have less from that corner, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only did he write the rules, but some of his staff say they did warn him about attending the party on the 20th of May 2020. Now, I've heard the Prime Minister's very carefully crafted response to that accusation. It almost sounds like a lawyer wrote it. So I'll be equally careful with my question. When did the Prime Minister first become aware that any of his staff had concerns about the 20th of May party?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to Right Honourable Gentleman for repeating the question that he's already asked. We have answered, Mr. Speaker, that it is for the inquiry to come forward with an explanation of what happened, and I'm afraid he simply must wait. But he asks about my staff, Mr. Speaker. He asks about my staff and what my staff are doing and what they have told me. And I can tell him, Mr. Speaker, that they have taken decisions throughout this pandemic that he has opposed to open up in July, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, to mount the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, and Mr. Speaker, to double the speed of the booster rollout, with the result that we have the most open economy in Europe, Mr. Speaker, and we have more people in employment and more employees on the payroll now than there were before the pandemic began. That is what my staff have been working on in Downing Street, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of them.
Keir Starmer.
So, Mr. Speaker, apparently Sue Gray is going to tell the Prime Minister when he first became aware that his staff had concerns about the May 20th. The Prime Minister's account gets more extraordinary with each version of his defence. If the Prime Minister's new defence were true, it requires him to suggest that his staff are not being truthful when they say they warned him about the party. It requires the Prime Minister to expect us to believe that whilst every other person who was invited on the 20th of May to the party was told it was a social occasion, he alone was told it was a work meeting. It also requires the Prime Minister to ask us to accept that as he waded through the empty bottles and platters of sandwiches, he didn't realise it was a party. Does the Prime Minister realise how ridiculous that sounds?
Mr. Speaker, I've said what I've said about the events in Number 10. He will have to wait for the report. And Mr. Speaker, I think he asks for further clarification. I think there are lots of people who are interested. I say this entirely in passing, Mr. Speaker. Lots of people are interested in the exact legal justification from the learned leader of the opposition for the picture of him drinking a pint of beer or a bottle of beer. Mr. Speaker, I merely perhaps he could tell the House about that in a minute, Mr. Speaker. But what I can tell the House is that throughout the pandemic, people across government have been working flat out to protect the British public with huge quantities of PPE, so we can now make 80% in this country, with the biggest and most generous furlough scheme virtually anywhere in the world, and the fastest. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, if we listened to them, we would have stayed in the European Medicines Agency, and we would never have been able to deliver the vaccine rollout at the speed that we did.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister thinks the only accusation he faces that he once had a beer with a takeaway, then Operation Save Big Dog is in deeper trouble than I thought. If a Prime Minister misleads Parliament, should they resign?
So, Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear. The Right Honourable Gentleman is continuing to ask a series of questions which he knows will be fully addressed by the inquiry. He is wasting this House's time. He's wasting the people's time, Mr. Speaker. He continues to be completely irrelevant, Mr. Speaker, but because we have an inquiry. We have an inquiry, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to anticipate that inquiry any further. What I can tell him is that it is because of the judgments that were taken in Downing Street and because of the willingness of the British people to put trust, by the way, Mr. Speaker, in those judgments, to come forward in huge numbers to get vaccinated, which people did, and I thank them for it from the bottom of my heart. People did that because they listened to our messages, Mr. Speaker, and it's as a result of that that we now have the fastest growing economy in the G7 and youth unemployment, which he ought to care about, youth unemployment at a record low, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Well, I know it's not going well, Prime Minister, but look on the bright side. At least the staff at Number 10 know how to pack a suitcase. Mr. Speaker, last year, Her Majesty the Queen sat alone when she marked the passing of the man she'd been married to for 73 years. She followed the rules of the country that she leads. On the eve of that funeral, a suitcase was filled with booze and wheeled into Downing Street. A DJ played and staff partied late into the night. The Prime Minister has been forced to hand an apology to Her Majesty the Queen. Isn't he ashamed that he didn't hand in his resignation at the same time?
Mr. Speaker, I understand why the right honourable gentleman continues to politicise issues.
Sorry, Prime Minister. We normally would not, and quite rightly, mention the royal family. We don't get into discussions on the royal family.
Well, in that case, Mr. Speaker, I must ask the right honourable gentleman to withdraw it.
I've dealt with it, Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer, are you going to...
Won't withdraw it.
Order! Prime Minister, we don't want to go through that again. I'll make the decisions. The answer is that the next question I'm going back to Keir Starmer to ask his final question. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the Prime Minister wastes energy defending the indefensible, people's energy bills are rocketing. Labour has a plan to deal with it. Axe VAT for everyone, provide extra support for the hardest hit, and pay for it with a one-off tax on oil and gas companies. A serious plan for a serious problem. What's the government offering? Nothing. Too distracted by their own chaos to do their job. While Labour was setting out plans to heat homes, he was buying a fridge to keep the party wine chilled. While we were setting out plans to keep bills down, he was planning parties. And while we were setting out plans to save jobs in the steel industry, he was trying to save just one job, his own. Doesn't the country deserve so much better than this out of touch, out of control, out of ideas, and soon to be out of office Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what this government has been doing to look after the people of this country throughout this pandemic and beyond. We have been cutting the cost of living, helping them with the living wage. We've been cutting taxes for people on low pay, Mr. Speaker. We've been increasing payments for people suffering the costs of fuel.
Prime Minister,
look after people.
Can I just say to everyone in here, our constituents wants to hear the questions and the answers. The great British public, the members of this United Kingdom which you're representing, they need to hear. Please, let's hear the questions and answers. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to look after people throughout this pandemic and beyond. But we've also, Mr. Speaker, been cutting crime by 10%, putting 11,000 more police officers already out on the street. Record home building last year, Mr. Speaker. More homes than at any time in the last 30 years. We are building 40 new hospitals, Mr. Speaker. Gigabit broadband has gone up from 9% coverage in our country to 65% already. And as I said already, I think 3 times or 4 times today, we have more people, more employees on the payroll now than before the pandemic began. And unemployment, youth unemployment, at a record low, Mr. Speaker. And when the history of this pandemic comes to be written, and the history of the Labour Party comes to be written, and believe me, they are history and will remain history, Mr. Speaker, it will show that we delivered while they dithered, and we vaccinated while they vacillated, Mr. Speaker. And the reason we've been able to lift restrictions faster than any other country in Europe, and we have the most open economy and the most open society in Europe, Mr. Speaker, is thanks to the booster rollout and thanks to the work of staff up and down Whitehall, across government, throughout the NHS, Mr. Speaker, and I am intensely proud of what this government has done.